You're gonna have to forgive me because my shirt's a bit tight. The weather is really warm, and I've been drinking coffee. So I'm a little bit confused, and added to my confusion, I just listened to a podcast with regards to. It wasn't specifically about identity, although that topic did come up a lot, especially during the question, the Q&A. So it, it's something that's really been gnawing at me in the last little while. Identity, right? Like, I mean, we all know it's bad. Um, well, most of us anyway, or at least the people I talk to. Um, but we struggle with it because on one hand, you have right and left identity politics, and somewhere in the middle, we have to kind of agree that identity does exist, but we don't want to politicize it. We don't want to create policy around the facts of identity, like skin color or race or gender, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's instructive to look to people like Steven Pinker, and I'm dropping names, but I think it's instructive to look at people like Steven Pinker who do say things like there is more commonality among the human race than there are differences. While those differences are important to study, and it could inform policy, especially in the social context, and especially now that globalization is taking over. I mean, there's lots of gender issues to face in developing countries, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, we've faced them in North America already. I mean, everybody has equal rights. So it's not like we're just falling into this like without any compass whatsoever. I mean, we kind of know what the story is. So it is important to look at those differences, but it's also extremely important to understand that we have much more in common than we do have when it comes that differences that we have. Anyway, point being is one of the more salient or more I don't know, mind altering kind of topics that they brought up was basically toxic masculinity. And Sam Harris in the podcast was saying that that toxic masculinity does exist, and I'm sure he's coming from a biological basis because he was referring specifically to men who engage in violent behavior, especially when in groups. So I'm sure there's a biological basis that he's coming from, but I think what I have an issue with is basically the Me Too movement and the way, as an example, that kind of just throws everybody into the same pool. So all men, et cetera, et cetera. You talk about, the patriarchy as being conflated with toxic masculinity, and you end up with this toxic masculinity that applies to all men, and it just kind of works that way. And this is maybe more of a radical feminist thing, but although I don't know how radical feminist that is, I think that's probably a little bit more well accepted and more largely accepted in terms of feminism and the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, et cetera, et cetera. I think that a lot of these things get just umbrellaed and kind of applied to large groups of people, especially men and especially white men. I don't know where's the and as a side point, like I mean, where's the intersectionality when it comes to white men? Like I mean, is there a reverse intersectionality going on with white men now? I mean, how like where's that going to be in 20 years or 10 years or 5 years from now? Anyway, that's just an interesting point. I mean, apparently we're all intersectional, whatever that means. So um, and in terms of like intersectionality when it comes to analyzing the power attributed to one group of people, I mean, power over who? Anyway, I'm getting, like I said, this identity stuff really gets to me, and it really does make me a little bit on edge. The coffee helps, but yeah, when it comes to say something like toxic femininity, I guess there's no biological basis for it. There's no, you can't really say that women have traditionally, on a biological or evolutionary basis, participated in very violent behavior in groups or individually, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's not to say, another thing that kind of pokes its head through when it comes to identity is there's so much variance, right? Like, I mean, we all have different social groups made up of a slew of different people, and we all interact differently on an individual basis, which is key to remember. Interacting on an individual basis humanizes something and actually makes it more palatable and a little bit easier to get along. And I think that's how we're largely based. all this identity politics stuff just kind of like lifts it up from the individual level and turns it into this kind of fascistic sort of thing. And I'm not exaggerating. There's a left fascism as well, Antifa and all these crazy groups. Um, but anyway, going back to the toxic femininity thing, it kind of reminded me of this Star article I read about women who have now come into full bloom when it comes to earning rights and having equal rights as men, but also participating in these destructive behaviors like drinking excessively. So and they do it in groups. They get together and they just drink excessively, which they didn't do before when they didn't have as many rights and they were supposed to be home and homemaking or whatever it is that they were supposed to be doing. But they're now given this freedom that they kind of bend and mold in these very unproductive ways. And the drinking thing is just one of those things that spikes at me. I don't know how social and how biological that is, but I do remember reading that article. And maybe it just applies to Canada. I don't know, but it's definitely a Canadian trend anyway. So it kind of reminds me of that as well. I mean, it's not a violent behavior, but I mean, it is drinking excessively. It's kind of a self-inflicted violence in a certain way. And look, I enjoy a few beers as well, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But it kind of reminded me of toxic femininity might be. Anyway, that's all I gotta say. Maybe not so much of a pointed video, but I think I kind of covered everything. I know I dropped names like the Steven Pinker thing. He's not the only one that thinks that, but sometimes I feel I kind of validate myself by looking to some of these great thinkers in terms of my own opinions, etc., etc. It's at least I know I'm not crazy, right? Anyway, that's all. Bye.